They tried to leave at midnight. All 47 of them, men, women, children, clutching the hands of their mothers. They gathered their few possessions, wrapped food in cloth, and moved silently through the darkness toward the tree line that marked the edge of Belmont Plantation. By dawn, they should have been miles away, following the North Star toward freedom. But when the sun rose on March 15, 1849, all 47 people were found collapsed at the exact boundary of the property. Not a single person had crossed the invisible line where Belmont land ended and the rest of Georgia began. They were unconscious, breath shallow, skin cold as winter despite the warm spring air. And when they woke, none of them could remember what had stopped them. They only knew one thing with absolute certainty. They could not leave. They would never leave. Not alive, anyway. Margaret Belmont discovered them there that morning, lying in neat rows as if something had carefully arranged their bodies. She stood at the edge of her property in her black mourning dress, still fresh from burying her husband 3 weeks prior, and felt ice crystallize in her veins. Because she recognized what she was seeing. Her husband had told her there were protections on the land. He'd said the property was secured, but she hadn't understood what he meant. Not until now. Not until she saw 47 people who had tried to escape lying motionless at the boundary, held by something that wasn't chains or walls or dogs, but something far more permanent. If you're listening to this and your skin is already crawling, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you is the darkest story I've ever researched for this channel. The Sealed Room goes deep into America's most disturbing historical mysteries, the ones that blur the line between reality and nightmare. And this story, this is something different. This is about a plantation in Georgia where people couldn't leave. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. Where an invisible force held souls prisoner even after their bodies gave out. Drop a comment and tell me where you're from. Does your state have stories like this? Legends about places where people got trapped? Let me know, because after you hear what happened at Belmont, you're going to start wondering what's buried in your own backyard. Now let me take you back. Back to February 1849, when Margaret Belmont became a widow at 32 years old and inherited a horror she didn't know existed. Belmont Plantation sat on 2,000 acres in central Georgia, about 15 miles west of Macon. The main house was built in 1791, a massive structure of red brick with white columns and a widow's walk on the roof, where, according to local legend, the original owner's wife had watched for ships that would never come because they were nowhere near the ocean. The house had passed through 3 families before Richard Belmont purchased it in 1834 with money from his father's shipping business in Savannah. Richard was 30 years old then, ambitious, educated in Charleston, and determined to establish himself as one of Georgia's prominent planters. He married Margaret Ashford 2 years later. She was 19, the daughter of a judge, raised with expectations of managing a grand household. Their marriage was cordial if not passionate. Richard was often distant, spending long hours in his study working on accounts and correspondence. Margaret managed the domestic sphere, the house servants, the kitchens, the gardens. They had separate bedrooms, separate lives that occasionally intersected at dinner or social functions. They never had children. Margaret assumed the fault was hers, though Richard never said so directly. He simply became more absorbed in the plantation's operations, more obsessed with productivity and efficiency. By 1849, Belmont was one of the most profitable properties in the region. The cotton yields were exceptional. The workforce seemed unusually stable, with almost no runaways, no escape attempts, no problems with discipline. Other planters asked Richard his secret. He would smile and say only that he'd made certain arrangements to ensure loyalty. Then in February, Richard caught pneumonia. He declined rapidly, and within a week he was delirious with fever, barely conscious. Margaret sat with him during his final hours, holding a cold cloth to his forehead while he muttered incomprehensibly. Most of it was fevered nonsense, but one phrase kept repeating. The boundary holds. The contract is sealed. They cannot cross. They cannot leave. Margaret assumed he was rambling about property boundaries, about fences or patrols. She didn't understand. Not yet. Richard died on February 23, 1849. He was 45 years old. Margaret buried him in the family plot behind the house, beneath a stone that read, Devoted Husband, Principled Master, Keeper of Belmont. That last phrase struck Margaret as odd when the stonemason showed her the design. Richard had written his own epitaph years earlier and insisted it be carved exactly as specified. Keeper of Belmont, not owner, keeper, as if the land required guarding, as if something needed to be kept. The trouble started immediately after the funeral. Marcus, one of the older men who worked in the stables, approached Margaret while she was cutting roses in the garden. He was agitated, turning his hat in his hands, his eyes darting toward the tree line. "Mrs.," he said quietly, "something's wrong. We need to leave. We need to go now." Margaret looked at him confused. "Leave where, Marcus?" "Leave here. Leave this place. It's not right. It's never been right. But now that Master Richard is gone, we thought maybe we could finally go. But we can't. Something won't let us." Margaret's first instinct was to dismiss this as grief or confusion, but something in Marcus's voice stopped her. "What do you mean, something won't let you?" "I mean, we can't cross the boundary, Mrs. I walked to the edge this morning, just to see, and I couldn't go no further. Tried to lift my foot, step over the line, and my whole body just seized up. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't move. Thought I was dying. Then I stepped back and everything was fine again." Margaret told Marcus he was being foolish, that he was frightened by Richard's death and imagining things. But that night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Richard's fevered words. The boundary holds. They cannot leave. At 3 a.m, she rose from bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked out to the edge of the property. The night was clear, the moon nearly full. She could see the fence line, the fields beyond, the dark mass of forest in the distance. Everything looked normal. But when Margaret reached out her hand toward the boundary, she felt it. A resistance. Not physical exactly, more like the air itself had thickened, become solid. She pushed harder and felt a vibration run through her arm, up her shoulder, into her chest. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply wrong, like touching something that violated natural law. She pulled back, her heart racing. What had Richard done? Margaret returned to the house and went directly to Richard's study, a room she had rarely entered during his life. He'd always kept it locked, claiming he needed privacy for business matters. Now the room was hers. She searched through his desk, through cabinets and boxes, looking for anything that might explain what she'd felt at the boundary. Most of what she found was ordinary. Account books, correspondence about cotton prices, letters from factors in Savannah and Charleston. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath a false panel, Margaret found a leather case secured with a small brass lock. She broke the lock with a letter opener and opened the case. Inside was a single document, yellowed with age, written in 2 different hands. The first section appeared to be in English, though the language was archaic, formal. The second section was in symbols Margaret didn't recognize, geometric shapes and marks that seemed to shift when she looked at them directly. The English portion was dated September 1834, just after Richard had purchased Belmont. It read, "I, Richard Belmont, do enter into covenant with the Keeper of Thresholds in exchange for prosperity, security, and absolute dominion over this land and all souls upon it. The terms are thus: no person bound to Belmont shall depart these grounds while breath remains in their body. No person bound to Belmont shall speak of this covenant to any outside these boundaries. No person bound to Belmont shall find release except through death or through the breaking of this covenant by the keeper's own hand. In exchange, the land shall yield abundance, the boundaries shall hold fast, and no rebellion shall prosper within these bounds. This covenant shall persist until the death of the covenant maker, at which time the covenant passes to the inheritor of Belmont, who becomes keeper in turn. The covenant may be dissolved only by the willing surrender of Belmont to those bound upon it, with all parties standing at the center point when the sun stands highest on the day of spring's balance." Margaret read the document 3 times, her hands shaking. This couldn't be real. Covenants with keepers of thresholds, magical boundaries, contracts that trapped souls. These were the stuff of folk tales and superstition, not reality. Yet she had felt the boundary herself. She had seen Marcus's terror. And Richard's final words suddenly made terrible sense. The boundary holds. They cannot leave. Her husband had made some kind of deal, some impossible arrangement that had turned Belmont Plantation into a prison. Not just physically, but metaphysically. The very land itself held everyone trapped. And now, according to this document, Margaret had inherited that role. She was the keeper now. The one who held the covenant. The one who kept souls bound to this place. She sat in Richard's chair until dawn, the document spread before her, trying to understand the full implications. If this covenant was real, and everything suggested it was, then every person on Belmont Plantation was trapped by forces Margaret didn't understand and couldn't control. They would live here, work here, suffer here, and die here, with no possibility of escape. And it was Margaret's inheritance, her responsibility, her sin to carry. But the document had mentioned something else. A way to break the covenant, the willing surrender of Belmont to those bound upon it, with all parties standing at the center point when the sun stands highest on the day of spring's balance. Margaret pulled out an almanac from Richard's shelf. The spring equinox was March 20th, just 5 days away. When the household began stirring at dawn, Margaret was still in the study. She heard the servants moving through the house, starting fires, preparing breakfast. She heard voices in the yard, the sounds of the plantation waking up. And she realized with crushing weight that every person here was trapped because of a deal her husband had made 15 years ago. A deal that had brought prosperity to Richard Belmont while condemning dozens of people to invisible chains stronger than iron. Margaret had always considered herself a practical woman. She'd never been particularly religious, never believed in ghosts or hauntings or supernatural forces, but she couldn't deny what she'd experienced at the boundary. She couldn't explain away that document with its impossible promises and its terrible implications. Something was holding people on this land, something her husband had invited in, bargained with, bound into the very soil of Belmont. The question was, what was she going to do about it? She could ignore it, pretend she'd never found the document, never felt the boundary's resistance. She could continue operating Belmont exactly as Richard had, reaping the benefits of the covenant while people remained trapped. Other plantation owners across the South held people in bondage through violence and law. Was this really any worse? But Margaret knew it was worse. This wasn't just legal slavery. This was something deeper, more absolute. These people couldn't even attempt escape. They couldn't hope for eventual freedom. They were bound by forces that transcended human law, trapped in a prison built from dark bargains and impossible contracts. And Margaret, whether she wanted it or not, was now responsible for maintaining that prison. She made a decision then, sitting in her dead husband's study as the sun rose over Belmont. She would break the covenant, whatever it took, whatever it cost. She would free these people from Richard's terrible legacy. March 20th, 5 days away. She had 5 days to figure out how to dissolve a supernatural contract she barely understood. 5 days to prepare for whatever consequences breaking such a covenant might bring. 5 days to undo 15 years of her husband's darkest secret. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. She needed to know the full extent of the covenant's power and the nature of the thing Richard had bargained with. She needed to find out what the Keeper of Thresholds really was. Margaret spent the morning after her discovery, doing something she had never done in her 13 years at Belmont. She walked the entire boundary of the property, all 2,000 acres. She needed to understand the scope of what Richard had created, needed to feel the extent of the invisible prison he'd built. She started at the northern edge where the property bordered a creek, followed the fence line east through pine forest, south through cotton fields, and west past the old tobacco barn that hadn't been used in years. The walk took her 6 hours, and everywhere at every point along that boundary she felt it. That wrongness, that thickening of reality. It was strongest at the corners where the property lines met, where she could feel something almost humming in the air, a vibration that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. But it wasn't just a barrier. It was aware. Margaret could sense it watching her as she walked, tracking her movement, recognizing her as the new keeper. The covenant had already transferred to her without her consent, without any ceremony or ritual. The moment Richard died, it had simply shifted, like a weight dropping onto her shoulders. She returned to the house exhausted, her feet blistered, her mind reeling. Sarah, one of the house servants, brought her tea and asked if she needed anything. Margaret looked at Sarah properly for the first time in years. Really looked at her. Sarah was perhaps 25, quick with her hands, always efficient and quiet. Margaret had never thought to ask where Sarah came from, if she had family elsewhere, what her life might have been before Belmont. Now, looking at Sarah's face, Margaret saw the truth she'd been blind to. This woman was trapped here, would die here, would never see anything beyond these 2,000 acres unless the covenant was broken. "How long have you known?" Margaret asked quietly. "Known what, missus?" "About the boundary. About not being able to leave." Sarah's hand stilled on the tea tray. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Fear, relief that someone was finally asking. "We've always known," Sarah said carefully. "Since the beginning. Master Richard told us when he first brought us here that Belmont was special, that we'd be safe here, protected, but that we could never leave. Most of us thought he just meant he'd hunt us down if we ran. But then people tried, and they couldn't get past the fence line. Couldn't cross the boundary no matter how hard they tried. After a while, we stopped trying. Did my husband explain why?" Margaret pressed. "Did he tell you what he'd done?" "He said it was for our own good," Sarah replied, and now her voice carried an edge. "Said the world outside was dangerous for people like us. Said we were safer here where he could protect us. But we knew the truth. We're not protected, Mrs. We're prisoners, and whatever is holding us here, it's not natural. It's not right." Margaret wanted to tell Sarah about her plan to break the covenant, but something stopped her. If she failed, if she couldn't dissolve the contract on the spring equinox, she didn't want to give false hope. Instead, she asked, "Has anyone ever died trying to cross the boundary?" Sarah's face went very still. "Yes, Mrs. 3 people. Margaret felt sick. "Tell me." "The first was a man named Jacob," Sarah said. "This was back in 35, right after Master Richard established whatever he established. Jacob ran for the boundary at night, tried to force himself through. They found him the next morning, dead. His face was frozen in this expression of terror, and his body was cold, so cold, like he'd been left in ice for days even though it was summer. The second was a woman named Ruth. She was pregnant, desperate to get her baby born somewhere else, anywhere else. She walked slowly toward the boundary, thinking maybe if she was gentle about it, maybe if she didn't fight, it would let her through. She collapsed halfway across, died right there with her unborn child. And the third?" Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The third was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He didn't understand what the boundary was. One day he was just playing, chasing a rabbit, and he ran straight toward the fence line. He hit the boundary at full speed, and it was like he hit a wall made of lightning. Threw him back 20 feet. He was breathing when we got to him, but his eyes were empty. Just blank. He lived another 3 days but never spoke, never moved, never recognized anyone. Then he just stopped breathing." Margaret closed her eyes against the horror of it. Richard had done this. Her husband, the man she'd shared a home with for 13 years, had condemned people to death trying to escape an invisible prison. And he'd called himself a keeper, as if he was protecting something valuable rather than imprisoning human souls. That night, Margaret returned to Richard's study and went through every document she could find. She needed to understand the mechanics of the covenant, needed to know if there were any warnings about what might happen when it was broken. She found ledgers showing Belmont's extraordinary productivity over the past 15 years, yields that were 30 to 40% higher than neighboring plantations. She found correspondence with other plantation owners who asked Richard about his methods. His responses were always vague. Good management, careful selection, proper incentives. Never any mention of supernatural contracts or imprisoned souls. But then Margaret found a second hidden compartment in Richard's desk, this one concealed behind a sliding panel in the back. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and locked. She broke the lock and began to read. The journal was Richard's personal account of how he'd learned about the covenant and why he'd chosen to make the deal. The first entry was dated August 1834, a month before the covenant was signed. Richard wrote, "Met today with a man who calls himself Solomon Gray, though I suspect that is not his true name. He approached me at the club in Macon, said he'd heard I'd purchased Belmont, and wondered if I knew the property's history. I admitted I knew only the basics, that it had passed through several owners, none of whom had made it profitable. Gray smiled at this and said he knew why. The land is old, Gray told me. Older than the house, older than Georgia, older than the colonies. The indigenous peoples who lived here before us, they knew what this place was. They knew there were thin places in the world where the boundaries between here and elsewhere grew permeable. Belmont sits on one of those places, a threshold, and thresholds can be guarded, controlled, if you know the right words, the right offerings, the right contracts." Margaret's hands trembled as she read. Richard had known exactly what he was doing. This wasn't an accident or a mistake. He had deliberately sought out this knowledge and used it to build his fortune. The journal continued. Gray explained that I could make an arrangement with what he called the keeper of thresholds. an ancient power that guards the boundaries between worlds, between life and death, between freedom and bondage. This power doesn't care about human morality or law. It cares only about contracts, about bargains properly made and properly kept. If I offered it dominion over the souls on my land, it would ensure those souls could never leave, could never escape, could never threaten my security or prosperity. In exchange, the land would thrive. The cotton would grow thick and healthy. The yields would be extraordinary, and I would never face the instability that plagued my neighbors. No runaways, no rebellions, no loss of investment. Gray told me the price, of course. He said the covenant would bind me as surely as it bound anyone else on the property. Once made, I could never leave Belmont either. I would be tied to this land until death, and the covenant would pass to my heirs, making them keepers in turn, unless they chose to break it through the ritual of release. I signed the contract without hesitation. What did I care if I could never leave? Belmont would be my kingdom, my legacy, and the people here would be absolutely secure, unable to run, unable to rebel, unable to threaten what I was building. Solomon Gray witnessed the signing. We performed the ritual at midnight on the autumn equinox at the exact center of the property, where the original house foundation once stood. I spoke the words Gray taught me, offered my blood to the earth, and felt the covenant seal itself into the land. The boundary activated immediately. I felt it snap into place like a lock turning. Since that night, Belmont has been exactly what I wanted. A perfect, controlled, prosperous enterprise. Margaret wanted to vomit. Richard had traded human freedom for cotton profits. He'd imprisoned dozens of people to guarantee his own success. And he'd documented it all in this journal with the casual tone of a man discussing livestock purchases. But the journal contained more. Later entries described how Richard had tested the boundary's limits, how he'd experimented to see what would happen if people tried to cross. He wrote clinically about the deaths Sarah had described. Jacob's death, Ruth's death, the boy's death. Each entry was cold, analytical, noting the effects of the boundary as if recording scientific observations. Subject attempted rapid crossing. Result, immediate cardiac arrest. Subject attempted slow crossing. Result, progressive system failure. Subject crossed boundary at high velocity. Result, severe neurological damage followed by death. It was monstrous. Margaret's husband had been a monster. The journal's final entries, written in the weeks before Richard's illness, took on a different tone. He wrote, "I have noticed something troubling. The boundary seems to be growing stronger. When I walk the property lines now, I feel it pulling at me, trying to hold me tighter. Last week I attempted to ride into Macon for business, and I barely made it past the gate before feeling such intense pain I thought my heart would burst. I turned back and the pain subsided immediately. I fear the covenant is consuming me, binding me more completely with each passing year." Gray warned me this might happen. He said the keeper of thresholds demands loyalty, demands that those who make contracts honor them absolutely. I have honored my contract. I have kept these people bound here for 15 years, but now it seems the contract is keeping me just as thoroughly. I cannot leave Belmont. I am as much a prisoner as anyone here, perhaps more so because I know what holds me. Margaret sat back, understanding dawning. Richard hadn't died of pneumonia. He'd died because he'd tried to leave. She remembered now, in those final days before his illness, Richard had talked about traveling to Charleston on business. He'd seemed anxious about it, reluctant, but his factors had insisted on a meeting. He'd left Belmont on a Monday morning. He'd returned 6 hours later, shaking and feverish, barely able to stand. He'd told Margaret he'd caught a chill on the road. But that wasn't what had happened. Richard had tried to break free of his own covenant, tried to cross the boundary he'd established, and it had killed him. The keeper of thresholds had enforced the contract unto death, which meant Margaret was in danger too. If the covenant had transferred to her, if she was now the keeper, then she might be just as bound as everyone else. Could she even leave Belmont to get help? Could she travel to Macon to find this Solomon Gray and demand answers? Or would the boundary hold her just as tightly as it held everyone else? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, Margaret ordered her horse saddled. She told Sarah she was riding into town for supplies. Sarah's expression was strange, knowing and worried at once. "Be careful, Mrs.," Sarah said quietly. "The land doesn't like to let go." Margaret rode toward the main gate, her heart pounding. As she approached the boundary, she felt it. That pressure building, that sense of reality thickening. But she pushed her horse forward, determined to cross. The horse balked. Margaret urged it on. Another step, another, and then the pain hit. It started in her chest, a crushing sensation like her ribcage was collapsing. Her vision blurred. Her hands went numb. The reins slipped from her fingers. She tried to breathe and couldn't, tried to scream and couldn't. Everything in her body was shutting down at once, systems failing, life force draining away. Then her horse stumbled backward, pulling her back across the boundary, and instantly the pain vanished. Margaret gasped, sucking in air, her whole body shaking. She was trapped, just like Richard, just like everyone else. The Covenant held her now. She returned to the house in a state of shock. Sarah was waiting on the porch, her face grim. "You felt it," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "I'm trapped too. We're all trapped, Mrs. Every soul on this land. And now that you know, now that you understand, the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Margaret looked at Sarah, saw the desperate hope barely concealed in her eyes. She thought about the document hidden in Richard's study, about the ritual of release, about the spring equinox now just 3 days away. "I'm going to break the covenant," Margaret said. "I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if it will work, but I'm going to try. Because this," she gestured at the land around them, at the invisible prison encompassing everything, "this is wrong. What my husband did was wrong, and I won't be the keeper of this horror. I won't." Sarah's face transformed. For the first time since Margaret had known her, Sarah smiled. A real smile, full of something Margaret hadn't seen in any of Belmont's people before. "Hope." "Then we'll help you," Sarah said. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes. We'll help you break this covenant and free every soul on this land, or die trying, because some things, Mrs., some things are worth dying for. And freedom, that's at the top of the list." Margaret felt tears burn her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. They had 3 days. 3 days to prepare for a ritual Margaret barely understood. 3 days to figure out how to satisfy the demands of an ancient power that had held this land in its grip for 15 years. 3 days to either free everyone or condemn them all to this prison forever. But at least now Margaret wasn't alone. At least now the people of Belmont knew someone was trying to break the chains. Even if those chains were invisible, even if those chains were woven from darkness and old magic and broken promises, they would try. And if they failed, at least they would fail together. That night, Margaret gathered everyone at the center of the property, where the original foundation stones still marked the spot where Richard had signed his covenant. She told them everything. About the document, about the keeper of thresholds, about the ritual of release that might, just might, set them free. She expected fear, maybe anger at her for being Richard's wife, for inheriting his role. Instead, she saw something else in their faces: determination. These people had spent 15 years trapped on this land, 15 years knowing they would die here without ever seeing anything beyond these boundaries. Now someone was offering them a chance, however slim, at freedom. They would take that chance, even if it killed them, because they were already dead in every way that mattered. All that remained was whether they would die as prisoners or die trying to break free. The spring equinox was 3 days away, and in those 3 days Margaret would learn things about Belmont that made even the Covenant seem gentle by comparison. Because Richard hadn't just bargained with the keeper of thresholds. He'd awakened something else, something that had been sleeping beneath Belmont for centuries, and it was starting to wake up. The dream started that night. Margaret woke at 2 a.m. from visions she couldn't quite remember, but that left her skin cold and her sheets soaked with sweat. Images of something vast and hungry moving beneath the earth, the sound of breathing that came from the ground itself, and voices, dozens of voices, whispering words in languages she didn't understand. She tried to dismiss it as anxiety about the approaching ritual, but when she went downstairs for water, she found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her hands trembling. "You dreamed it too," Sarah said. "Didn't you? The thing underground." Margaret sat down heavily. "What is it?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered. "But it's been here longer than the Covenant, longer than the house, longer than any of us. And ever since Master Richard died, ever since the Covenant started shifting to you, it's been waking up." Over the next 2 days, others reported similar dreams. Marcus dreamed of roots made of bone spreading through the soil. A woman named Alice dreamed of chambers deep below the plantation, rooms carved from earth and stone, filled with things that should have been dead but weren't. A boy named Thomas dreamed of eyes opening in the darkness, countless eyes, all watching, all waiting. Something was stirring beneath Belmont, and it was connected to the covenant. Margaret returned to Richard's journal, reading more carefully now, looking for any mention of what might lie beneath the property. She found an entry from October 1835, a year after the covenant was signed. Richard wrote, "Gray visited again today. I asked him about the disturbances. The sounds coming from beneath the house at night. The way certain rooms feel colder than they should. The sensation of being watched even when alone." Gray laughed, though it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You built your house on a threshold," he reminded me. "Did you think the keeper of thresholds was the only thing here? Did you think you were the first to try and use this place's power?" The entry continued. "Gray told me that the indigenous peoples who once lived here considered this ground cursed. Not sacred, not holy, but cursed. They believed something had been buried here in ancient times, something that fed on boundaries, on the space between living and dead, free and bound. When I made my covenant, when I activated the threshold, I didn't just summon the keeper. I woke what was sleeping underneath. Gray said it would remain dormant as long as I maintained the covenant, as long as I kept feeding it through the boundary's power. But if the covenant ever weakened, if I ever died without a proper heir to maintain it, the thing below would begin to wake. And once fully awake, it would consume everything on this land, every soul, every life, pulling them down into whatever darkness it inhabits." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice water. Richard had known. He'd known that breaking the covenant would wake something worse than the covenant itself. And he'd done nothing to prevent it, taken no precautions, left no instructions. He'd simply assumed the covenant would continue indefinitely, passed from keeper to keeper, holding the thing below in eternal sleep. But Margaret had already decided to break the covenant, and now she learned that breaking it might unleash something even more terrible. She gathered everyone again that evening, 2 days before the spring equinox, and told them what she'd discovered. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Marcus spoke. "So we have 2 choices. Stay trapped here forever, bound by the covenant, never free, or break the covenant and face whatever is underneath. Those aren't choices, Mrs. Those are just 2 different ways to die." "Maybe not," Margaret said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "The ritual of release, the one Richard documented, it says the covenant can be dissolved by willingly surrendering Belmont to those bound upon it. Maybe that's the key. Maybe if I transfer ownership properly, if I give this land freely to all of you, the covenant will end without waking what's below." "And if it doesn't?" Sarah asked quietly. "Then we face it together," Margaret said, "all of us, because I won't keep you imprisoned here, and I won't maintain my husband's evil just to keep something else contained. If there's a monster under Belmont, we'll deal with it, but we'll deal with it as free people, not as prisoners." The debate went on for hours. Some argued for attempting the ritual. Others thought they should leave the covenant intact, accepting imprisonment rather than risking something worse. But eventually a consensus emerged. They would try. They would attempt the ritual on the spring equinox, at midday when the sun stood highest, following the instructions in Richard's document. And whatever happened after that, whatever came from below, they would face it together. That night Margaret couldn't sleep. She walked through the house, listening to it settle and creak, and for the first time truly paid attention to the sounds. There were the normal noises of an old house, wood expanding and contracting, wind against windows. But underneath those sounds was something else. A low vibration almost below the threshold of hearing, a rhythm like breathing, and it was coming from beneath the floors. Margaret descended to the cellar carrying a lamp. The cellar ran the length of the house, its walls made of rough stone, its floor packed dirt. She'd been down here before, of course, but always briefly, always for practical purposes, retrieving preserved goods or checking on supplies. Now she looked at the cellar differently, seeing it not as a storage space but as the boundary between the house and whatever lay deeper. The breathing sound was clearer down here, unmistakable, and there was something else, a smell. Not rot exactly, but something organic, something that suggested life in places where life shouldn't be. Margaret moved along the cellar walls, running her hands over the stone, looking for anything unusual. In the far corner, behind a shelf of dusty bottles, she found it. The stones here were different, older. The mortar between them was darker, stained with something that looked like dried blood. And there was a gap, a space between 2 stones just wide enough to see through. Margaret brought her lamp close and looked through the gap. The light didn't penetrate far, but she could see that there was space beyond the wall. A cavity, a chamber. and in that chamber something moved. Margaret jerked back, her heart hammering. She stood there for a long moment, trying to convince herself she'd imagined it. Then she looked again. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible. Like breathing, like something vast and patient, waiting in darkness, gathering strength. Margaret backed away from the wall, nearly tripping over the shelf. She needed to get out of the cellar, needed fresh air, needed to think. As she turned toward the stairs, every lamp in the cellar went out at once. Total darkness engulfed her. And in that darkness she heard a voice. Not through her ears exactly, but inside her head, vibrating through her bones. "Keeper," the voice said. The word echoed, multiplied, came from everywhere and nowhere. "You have inherited the covenant. You hold the boundary. You maintain the seal." "Yes," Margaret whispered, though she didn't know why she answered. "The seal must be maintained," the voice continued. "What sleeps must continue sleeping. What is bound must remain bound." "I want to break the covenant," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "I want to free these people." A sound like laughter, if laughter could be made of stone grinding against stone. "Break the covenant and I rise. Free the prisoners and I feed. The boundary is not just a prison, Keeper. It is a seal. It holds me down as much as it holds them in. Your husband understood this. He accepted this. You must accept it too." "I won't," Margaret said. "I won't keep people in prison just to keep you contained. Then you doom them," the voice said. "And yourself, and every soul on this land. When the covenant breaks, when the seal fails, I will rise from the depths where I have waited since before your kind built cities or wrote words, or understood that death is not an ending. I will pull every life on this property down into my domain, and I will consume them slowly, over centuries, feeding on their essence, their memories, their souls. This is not a threat, Keeper. This is a promise. This is the natural consequence of breaking what your husband built." The lamps flickered back to life all at once. Margaret found herself on her knees, gasping. Her lamp had fallen and broken, oil spreading across the dirt floor. She scrambled up the stairs and out of the cellar, slamming the door behind her. Sarah found her in the hallway, shaking and pale. "What happened?" Sarah asked. "I spoke to it," Margaret whispered. "The thing underneath. It told me that breaking the covenant will wake it. We'll free it. We'll let it consume everyone here?" Sarah's face went hard. "Then we're damned either way. Trapped by the covenant or consumed by what's below. At least if we break the covenant, we'll have died trying to be free." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but she couldn't see one. Richard had built a perfect trap. Keep the covenant and remain prisoners. Break it and face something worse. There was no winning, only choosing which horror to embrace. Unless, Margaret thought suddenly, unless there was a third option. The covenant said it could be broken by the willing surrender of Belmont to those bound upon it. But what if that surrender included the land itself? What if Margaret didn't just give ownership to the people, but gave them the power of the threshold? What if she transferred the role of keeper to all of them collectively, making them guardians rather than prisoners? It was dangerous, possibly impossible. The document said nothing about multiple keepers, but it was the only alternative Margaret could see. The next day, the day before the spring equinox, Margaret gathered everyone and explained her plan. Instead of simply dissolving the covenant, she would attempt to transfer it. Make every person on Belmont a joint keeper, sharing the responsibility of maintaining the boundary and holding down the thing below, but doing so as free people who chose to stay rather than prisoners forced to remain. The response was mixed. Some saw the wisdom in it. If they could be keepers together, if they could control the boundary rather than be controlled by it, they might be able to weaken it gradually, eventually dismantling it without releasing what was underneath. Others argued it was just slavery with a different name. Choosing to stay wasn't freedom if the alternative was being consumed by a monster. Marcus spoke up, his voice carrying across the gathering. "Seems to me," he said, "we need to know what we're actually dealing with. We've been told there's something down there, something dangerous. But we've only got Master Richard's word and that voice Mrs. Margaret heard. What if it's lying? What if the thing underground is just trying to keep us scared, keep us locked up? What if breaking the covenant won't actually wake anything, and that's just a story to keep the keeper from ever setting people free?" It was a good point. Everything they knew about what lay beneath Belmont came from either Richard's journal or the entity itself, neither of which were trustworthy sources. But how could they verify the truth without risking everyone's lives? "I'll go down," a voice said. Everyone turned. It was Thomas, the boy who dreamed of eyes in the darkness. He was maybe 14, thin and quiet, but his face was set with determination. I'll go down and see what's really there. If there's something down there worth fearing, I'll come back and tell you. And if there's not, we'll know we've been lied to all these years. You can't, Margaret said. If something happens to you, then something happens to me, Thomas interrupted. But I'd rather die finding the truth than live as a prisoner because I was too scared to look. Before anyone could stop him, Thomas turned and ran toward the house. Marcus and 2 other men chased after him, but Thomas was fast. He reached the cellar door, threw it open, and descended into darkness. Margaret ran after him, Sarah close behind. They found Thomas in the far corner of the cellar, the corner where Margaret had seen the gap in the wall. He was pulling at the stones, trying to make the opening larger. "Stop," Margaret shouted. "Thomas, you don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Thomas called back. "I'm done being afraid. I'm done living in a cage. If there's a monster down there, I want to see it. I want to look it in the eyes and know what's real." He pulled one of the old stones free. Then another. The gap widened, becoming a hole large enough for a person to squeeze through. The breathing sound from beyond grew louder. The smell intensified, and then Thomas looked back at them, grinned fearlessly, and climbed through the hole. "No!" Margaret lunged forward, but she was too late. Thomas disappeared into the darkness beyond the wall. For a moment there was silence. Then Thomas screamed. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of agony, of something fundamental being torn away. The sound cut off abruptly, and then something came through the hole. Not Thomas, something else. It looked almost human, but wrong, like a shadow given 3 dimensions, like darkness compressed into a shape that approximated a person. Where it moved, the air grew cold. Where it touched the cellar floor, the dirt blackened and died. It turned its head toward Margaret, and she saw that it had no face, just a smooth expanse of shadow where features should have been. And yet she could feel it looking at her, recognizing her, knowing her, keeper, it said in that voice of grinding stone. "The boy has been accepted. He will serve in the depths now. He will feed me for a very long time." Behind the shadow thing, Margaret could hear sounds from beyond the wall. Wet sounds, sounds of something being consumed. Thomas was gone, taken, fed to whatever lived in the darkness under Belmont. The shadow thing stepped closer. Its voice was almost gentle. "You see now, you understand. Break the covenant, and I will take everyone. Not just prisoners, everyone, you, the house servants, the field workers, every child, every soul. All will descend into my domain, and I will feast on them until the stars grow cold." Margaret felt Sarah's hand grip her arm, pulling her back toward the stairs. But Margaret couldn't move. She was frozen, staring at the thing, understanding with terrible clarity what Richard had done. Her husband hadn't just made a covenant to imprison people. He'd made a deal with something ancient and hungry, something that fed on trapped souls, that grew stronger the more people were bound to this land. The covenant didn't just create prisoners. It created food, and breaking the covenant wouldn't free anyone. It would just change how they were consumed, slowly as prisoners or quickly as the shadow things feast. Margaret finally found her voice. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," the shadow thing said. "There has never been another way. From the moment the first peoples marked this ground as cursed, from the moment they sealed me here with their blood and bones, there has been no escape. Your husband simply made the seal more efficient. And you, keeper, will maintain it, or you will all fall into darkness together." The thing turned and flowed back through the hole in the wall, disappearing into the depths. The breathing sound continued, steady and patient. Margaret and Sarah stood in the cellar, the reality of their situation crushing down on them. Tomorrow was the spring equinox. Tomorrow they were supposed to perform the ritual to break the covenant. But now they knew the truth. Breaking the covenant meant death for everyone, but maintaining it meant eternal imprisonment, unless Margaret could find a third option. Unless she could discover what the first peoples had done to seal this thing originally, before Richard's covenant complicated everything. Unless she could somehow undo not just Richard's deal, but the ancient curse beneath it. She had one day. One day to find an answer that might not exist. One day to save everyone or doom them all. But the sealed room doesn't deal in easy answers, does it? We deal in truth, no matter how dark that truth might be. And the truth about Belmont Plantation was darker than anyone could have imagined. Margaret returned to the house that night knowing she had to make a choice. A choice that would determine the fate of every soul on the property. A choice between horrors. And time was running out. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, She saw Thomas being pulled into darkness, heard his scream cut short, felt the shadow thing's eyeless gaze on her. She'd gotten that boy killed. Her curiosity, her determination to understand the threat, had cost him his life, and tomorrow her decision would determine whether anyone else followed him into that darkness. She spent the hours before dawn going through every document in Richard's study, searching for anything about the original sealing, about the first peoples who had marked this ground as cursed. Most of Richard's papers were useless, accounts and correspondence that had nothing to do with the covenant. But in the leather case where she'd found the original contract, she discovered something she'd missed before. A second, smaller document folded and hidden beneath the first. It was older, much older. The paper was brittle, covered in symbols she didn't recognize. But there were also drawings. Figures standing in a circle. A pit or well at the center. Lines radiating outward like spokes on a wheel, each line ending in what looked like a post or marker. And at the bottom, in handwriting that wasn't Richard's, someone had translated a phrase. The thing that feeds on boundaries can only be sealed by those willing to become boundaries themselves. Margaret stared at those words, trying to understand. Become boundaries themselves. What did that mean? She thought about the shadow thing's words. The first peoples had sealed it with their blood and bones. They hadn't just performed a ritual. They'd sacrificed themselves, become part of the seal, transform themselves into the boundary that held the thing down. That was the original sealing. Not a covenant or a contract, but people choosing to give their lives, their very essence, to create a permanent barrier between the shadow thing and the world above. And that seal had held for centuries, maybe millennia, until Richard came along and built his covenant on top of it, complicating everything, weakening the original seal while creating a new prison above it. Margaret looked at the drawing again, counting the figures in the circle. 13. 13 people had performed the original sealing. Had all of them died, or had they somehow survived, transformed, become something other than human in order to maintain the boundary? She needed answers, and there was only one place she might find them. The center of the property where Richard had performed his covenant ritual, where the original foundation stones marked the site of something older. Margaret took the document and a lamp and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was strange, charged, as if reality itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come. She reached the center point, where the foundation stones formed a rough circle about 20 feet across. She'd always assumed they were remnants of the original house, but looking at them now with new understanding, she saw they were something else. They were markers, boundary stones, each one carefully placed, each one inscribed with symbols worn smooth by time, but still faintly visible. Margaret set her lamp on the ground and walked around the circle, studying each stone. They were arranged in a pattern, she realized. Not random, but deliberate, mathematical. And at the exact center of the circle there was a depression in the ground. Not recent, old, as if something had been buried there long ago, and the earth had settled over it. Margaret knelt and began digging with her hands, pulling away soil and dead grass. A foot down, her fingers struck something solid. She dug more carefully, exposing what she'd found. It was a stone bowl, carved from a single piece of dark rock, its interior stained black. At the bottom of the bowl she found bones. Small bones, finger bones, she thought, 13 of them, one from each of the original sealers. They'd given their blood and a part of themselves to create the boundary. And that boundary was still here, buried beneath Richard's covenant, still holding, but weakening. Margaret sat back, understanding beginning to dawn. The original seal was failing, not because Richard's covenant had damaged it, but because it was simply old. Centuries old. The people who had created it were long dead. Their power faded, their sacrifice wearing thin. Richard's covenant had actually been supporting it, reinforcing it, feeding it with the trapped souls above. But Richard hadn't understood what he was doing. He'd thought he was making something new when he was actually maintaining something ancient. And if Margaret broke the covenant now, she wouldn't just be freeing prisoners. She'd be removing the last support holding the original seal together. The shadow thing would rise not because breaking the covenant awakened it, but because breaking the covenant would destroy the final barrier keeping it contained. Margaret heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Sarah approaching, followed by Marcus and several others. They'd seen her leave the house, had followed her here.
"What did you find?"
Sarah asked. Margaret showed them the bowl, the bones, the ancient stones. She explained what she'd pieced together. The original seal, Richard's covenant layered on top. The shadow thing trapped between them, feeding on whatever leaked through. We can't break the covenant, Margaret said, her voice hollow. If we do, the original seal fails completely, and that thing consumes everyone. But we can't maintain it either, Marcus said. We can't stay prisoners forever. So what do? Margaret looked at the 13 bones in the stone bowl, at the 13 boundary markers around the circle, at the document describing people becoming boundaries themselves. There's a third way, she said slowly. But it requires sacrifice. It requires people willing to give up everything, their lives, their futures, their freedom, to become the seal themselves. To replace the original sealers and create a new boundary, one strong enough to hold the shadow thing down permanently. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Sarah spoke. You're talking about dying, about sacrificing ourselves. Not exactly dying, Margaret said. The original sealers didn't die. They transformed, became part of the boundary. Their consciousness, their essence, woven into the fabric of the seal. They would have existed in a state between life and death, aware but not alive, present but not physical. Forever. That's worse than dying, someone said. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But it would be a choice. The original sealers chose. Richard's prisoners didn't. If we do this, if 13 of us volunteer to become the new seal, everyone else goes free. The covenant ends. The boundary dissolves for those who aren't part of the seal. They can leave, start new lives, be truly free. And the 13 who sacrifice themselves will hold the shadow thing down, not for their lifetimes but forever, or until someone else finds a better solution. Marcus shook his head. You're asking people to volunteer for eternal imprisonment. Who would do that? I would, Sarah said immediately. Every head turned to her. She stood straight, her face calm. I've lived my entire adult life as a prisoner, 20 years in bondage. If I can buy freedom for everyone else, if I can make sure no one else ever gets trapped here, I'll do it. I'll become part of the seal. You don't know what you're saying, Margaret protested. You don't know what it means to exist like that, aware but not alive, trapped in a state between. I know I've been trapped my whole life anyway, Sarah replied. At least this way, my prison would have purpose. At least I'd be choosing it. And I wouldn't be alone, because there would be 12 others with me. 12 others who made the same choice. That's more companionship than I've had in years. Another voice spoke up. A man named Joseph, one of the field workers. I'll do it. I lost my wife to the boundary 5 years ago. She tried to cross and died in the attempt. If this seal can prevent others from dying like she did, I'll become part of it. One by one. Others volunteered. Marcus, a woman named Grace, an elderly man named Samuel who said he didn't have many years left anyway, and would rather spend them protecting people than serving them. A young woman named Hannah, 2 brothers, David and Solomon, who said they'd rather face eternity together than watch others suffer. By the time the sun began to rise, 12 people had volunteered. 12 who were willing to give up their lives, their freedom, their very existence, to create a seal strong enough to hold the shadow thing down and free everyone else. But they needed 13. The ritual required 13, and no one else was volunteering. Margaret looked around the circle at the faces of people who had suffered for 15 years under Richard's covenant, who had every right to walk away, to claim their freedom, to refuse any further sacrifice. She couldn't ask more of them, which meant there was only one person left who could complete the 13. Herself. I'll be the 13th, Margaret said quietly. No, Sarah said immediately. You're the keeper. You're the one who found the answer. You deserve to be free more than anyone. I'm Richard's widow, Margaret replied. I inherited his sin, his covenant, his role in all of this. It's fitting that I should be the one to end it, to replace his evil with something better. And besides, she added with a sad smile, I can't leave anyway. The covenant bound me just like it bound him. I tried to cross the boundary, remember? It nearly killed me. Even if we free everyone else, I would still be trapped. This way, at least I'm choosing what kind of prison I inhabit. The 12 looked at her with a mixture of respect and sorrow. Then it's decided, Marcus said. 13 volunteers. We perform the ritual at midday when the sun stands highest. We become the seal, and everyone else goes free. But there's one problem, Joseph pointed out. We don't know the ritual. Master Richard's document doesn't explain how the original sealing was done. We have the bones of the old sealers and the boundary stones, but we don't have the words, the actions, the method. We'll have to figure it out, Margaret said. And she checked her pocket watch, 6 hours to do it. They spent the morning preparing. Margaret studied the old document, trying to decipher the symbols and drawings. The others gathered at the center circle, examining the boundary stones, the buried bowl, the layout of everything. Slowly, a picture emerged. The ritual wasn't complicated in its mechanics, but it was absolute in its cost. The 13 would stand in a circle around the bowl. Each would offer blood, the same way Richard had. Each would offer a bone, a finger bone, cut from their own hand. Each would speak words of binding, declaring their willingness to become the boundary, to exist between worlds, to hold the darkness down. And then at the moment when the sun stood directly overhead, they would join hands and together step into the space between life and death. The transition would be instant. Their physical bodies would dissolve, their essence would spread throughout the boundary, and they would become living seals, conscious barriers holding the shadow thing imprisoned. Margaret didn't tell the others that she'd found one more line in the document. A warning. Once transformed, the sealers cannot be freed except through their own dissolution. To release them would require destroying the seal itself and releasing what they contain. They would be trapped forever, truly forever, unless they chose to let go, to dissolve themselves, which would free them into death but also free the shadow thing. It was an impossible position, but then everything about Belmont had been impossible from the start. At noon, as the spring sun climbed toward its zenith, everyone on Belmont Plantation gathered at the center circle. The 13 who would become the seal, the 34 who would be freed. Margaret stood at the north point of the circle, Sarah at the east, Marcus at the south, Joseph at the west. The others filled in the spaces between, creating a ring of human beings around the ancient stone bowl. The rest of the plantation's people formed a larger circle around them, witnesses to what was about to happen. Margaret had prepared a knife, sharp and clean. She spoke to everyone. "What we're about to do," she said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "will end Richard Belmont's covenant. It will free those who have been imprisoned here. But it will create a new seal, one that holds down something far older and far more dangerous than any human cruelty. 13 of us have volunteered to become that seal, to exist between life and death, holding the darkness down, protecting not just you, but everyone who might ever come to this land. We ask that you remember us, that you tell our stories, that you make sure our sacrifice means something." She looked at each of her fellow volunteers, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also the determination. They were ready. She raised the knife. The ritual began. One by one, each volunteer spoke their name, cut their left hand's smallest finger to the bone, and let blood drip into the stone bowl. The pain was extraordinary, but each person bore it in silence. When all 13 had bled into the bowl, Margaret saw that the blood wasn't pooling. It was being absorbed into the stone, disappearing into the black-stained interior as if the bowl itself was drinking it. Next came the bones. This was worse. Each person had to remove their smallest finger entirely, cutting through tendon and joint, adding the severed digit to the bowl. Margaret went last, her hand shaking, her vision blurring with pain. When she dropped her finger into the bowl, she heard a sound, deep, resonant, coming from beneath the earth. The shadow thing knew what they were doing, and it was not pleased. The volunteers joined hands, their blood mixing where their palms pressed together. Margaret felt power flowing through the circle, connecting them, beginning to weave them together into something larger than themselves. Now the words. Margaret had found them inscribed on the back of the old document, hidden in symbols that revealed themselves only when held up to sunlight. She spoke them first, and the others repeated, their voices becoming one voice, 13 mouths speaking the same words in perfect unison. We are the boundary. We are the threshold. We are the space between here and there, between life and death, between darkness and light. We give ourselves to the seal. We become the seal. We hold what must be held. We bind what must be bound, until the stars grow cold, until the world ends, until we choose to let go. The sun reached its zenith, noon, the equinox moment, the instant when day and night balanced perfectly. And in that balance, in that liminal moment between one season and another, the 13 stepped forward together. Not physically. Their bodies remained standing in the circle, but something else moved, their essence, their consciousness, their souls if such things existed. Margaret felt herself stretching, expanding, becoming thin and vast. She could feel the others with her, their presences merging with hers, becoming a web, a net, a barrier woven from 13 human lives. She could feel the boundaries of Belmont, every inch of the 2,000 acres. Could feel the fence lines, the tree line, the creek, the roads. Could feel every living thing on the property, every person, every animal, every blade of grass. And beneath it all, she felt the shadow thing. It was massive, ancient beyond comprehension. It existed in layers, in dimensions that human minds weren't meant to perceive. It was hunger and patience and cruel intelligence. It had been here since before humans evolved, since before the continents took their current shapes. It had been sealed by the first peoples thousands of years ago, and it had been waiting, feeding on whatever leaked through, growing stronger with every generation. Richard's covenant had been feeding it for 15 years, giving it a slow but steady stream of trapped life force. And it wanted more. It wanted everything. But now Margaret and the 12 others stood in its way. They were the new seal, stronger than the old one, woven from willing sacrifice rather than desperate last stands. The shadow thing raged against them, pushing, testing, trying to find weakness. But the 13 held. They were the boundary now. They were the threshold, and they would hold as long as they chose to exist. Margaret felt her physical body dissolve, saw through eyes that were no longer eyes as her form became translucent, then transparent, then simply gone. The same happened to all 13. Their bodies faded, their physical existence ended, but their consciousness remained, spread throughout the boundary, present everywhere and nowhere. The covenant broke. She felt it snap like a chain severed. The invisible prison that had held souls on Belmont for 15 years simply ceased to exist. The people standing in the outer circle, the 34 who had not volunteered, suddenly felt it. The boundary was gone. They could leave. They were free. For a moment, no one moved. They couldn't believe it. Then someone took a tentative step toward the tree line. Then another step. They reached what had been the boundary, and nothing stopped them. They crossed it. They were beyond Belmont. They were free. A cheer went up. People cried, embraced, ran toward the fence line to test their freedom. Marcus's wife called his name, then saw his body, translucent and fading, and understood. She reached toward him, but her hand passed through. He was already gone, already part of the seal, already beyond human touch. One by one, the freed people of Belmont said goodbye to the 13 who had sacrificed everything for them. Then they left. Some went north, some east, some scattered in all directions, claiming their freedom, starting new lives, carrying the story of what had happened here. Within a week, Belmont Plantation was deserted. The house stood empty. The fields went unplanted. The property reverted to wilderness. Margaret existed in the boundary, aware of all of this. She could feel seasons change, could sense time passing, could perceive the shadow thing below, still raging, still testing the seal, but unable to break through. The 13 were strong enough. Together they held. Years passed, decades, the house decayed. Trees grew through the foundation. The property changed hands several times, but no one stayed long. People felt something wrong about the land, something that made them uneasy. They didn't know they were feeling the boundary, the seal, the presence of 13 souls holding darkness down. Margaret lost track of time. 1 year felt like a moment, a decade like a breath. She existed in a state of eternal present, always aware, never sleeping, never resting. The others were with her, their consciousness intertwined with hers. They had become something other than human. Not alive, not dead. Something in between. And in that in-between space, Margaret found something unexpected. Purpose. She was protecting people. Every person who might ever step on this land. Every future generation. She and the 12 others were holding a horror at bay, ensuring it could never rise, never feed, never consume the world above. Richard had imprisoned people to build his fortune. Margaret and the others had imprisoned themselves to build something better. Freedom for those who deserved it. Protection for those who needed it. It wasn't the life Margaret had imagined, but it was a life of a sort, an existence with meaning. In 1923, when historians discovered Richard's documents and began investigating Belmont's history, Margaret felt them. Felt their curiosity, their horror at what they learned, their determination to understand. She wished she could speak to them, tell them the full story, but she had no voice. She was the boundary. Boundaries don't speak. They simply exist. Over the decades, stories about Belmont spread. People whispered about the cursed plantation where slaves had disappeared. where the mistress had vanished, where something old and evil lurked beneath the soil. The stories were half true, which made them more persistent than lies. And Margaret listened to every story, existing in her eternal vigil, holding the shadow thing down with 12 others who had chosen this fate. Are they still there? Is Margaret Belmont still holding the boundary at what was once Belmont Plantation? I can't tell you for certain. The property exists. You can find it if you look hard enough at old Georgia maps. The land is privately owned now, posted against trespassers, though people still report strange feelings when they get too close. That sense of being watched, that awareness of something vast and patient waiting beneath the earth. Some say if you visit the center of the old property, where foundation stones still mark a circle in the overgrown forest, you can feel them. The 13. Not ghosts exactly, but presences. Consciousnesses woven into the fabric of reality itself, protecting you from something you'll never see, holding back a darkness you'll never face because they chose to face it forever. I think about that sometimes, about Margaret Belmont and the 12 others who gave up everything, their lives, their freedom, their very existence, to protect people they would never meet. People like you and me, living our lives, never knowing that beneath our feet, in places marked by old curses and older seals, there are those who hold the darkness back. What would you do in Margaret's position? Would you maintain the evil to protect people from something worse? Would you break the evil and face the consequences? Or would you find that third option, that narrow path between horrors that requires sacrifice beyond imagining? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the weight of impossible choices, share it. Tell others about the sealed room, where we dig into the stories that blur the line between history and horror, between what was and what might still be. Subscribe if you haven't already, because next week we're going into another sealed place, another boundary where something waits. And comment below. Tell me, do you believe in places where the veil grows thin, places where old powers still hold sway? Because I've learned something researching these stories. Some places are marked, some ground is cursed, and sometimes the only thing standing between us and absolute darkness is people who chose to become boundaries themselves. Margaret Belmont and the 12 others may still be out there, existing in that space between life and death, holding their vigil, protecting us all. We'll never know their names. We'll never hear their voices. But maybe, just maybe, we should remember them anyway. Remember that freedom sometimes costs more than we can imagine, and that the greatest act of love is choosing imprisonment so that others might be free. Sleep well tonight, and if you feel safer than you should, if you feel like something is protecting you from horrors you can't see, maybe you're right. Maybe there are boundaries you don't know about. Maybe there are seals you've never questioned. Maybe there are those who sacrificed everything so you could live without fear. That's the story of Belmont Plantation. The mistress who inherited evil and chose to become something better. The 12 who joined her, and the darkness they hold down still. Until next time, this is the sealed room, where we remember the stories that history forgot, and the sacrifices that nobody sees.